Webinar, Planning for Housing Need in the Post-COVID City. We're recording this webinar, and my name is Dr. Quintin Bradley, Senior Lecturer in Planning and Housing. And our speakers this afternoon are Steve Quartermain, formerly Chief Planning Officer at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, Martin Elliot, Head of Strategic Planning at Leeds City Council, Justin Gartland from Lichfields, and Jessica Spencer from Urbanistas NW. Just some housekeeping, if you don't mind, please keep your microphones off, on mute, during the presentations, and your cameras off as well. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentations, and we'll be taking the questions, at least initially, from the chat. So please type in your questions as we go along and as the speakers are presenting. And I'm assisted today by Donna Lee, who will be monitoring the chat and then reading out your questions. Just a word about Martin, one of the speakers, Martin Elliot, will be leaving after his talk, but he has deputised David Feeney, who is the Chief Planning Officer at Leeds City Council, to take questions in his stead. So thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And we're really looking forward to this presentation. And our first speaker is Steve Quartermain. Thank you, Steve. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Bradley, and welcome to this event, everybody. I'm reflecting on the number of people watching this. When I first agreed to speak at this event, it was, will you talk to the students at the university? And I don't know why, I sort of thought there'd be about 20 people in the room and the maximum. But I'm delighted that so many people have turned up today. I'm going to speak to only one slide, and Bradley, if you can show that slide now, I'll explain why. There's 14 sort of bubbles on this slide, and one of the questions that I want us to come back to in our discussion is, what would you add in the space I've left to add to this debate? I've chosen these ones because I think these are the basics, if you like, the components. One of the reasons I've put it onto one slide is that I think it's really important when you're looking at the challenge of providing housing in a post-COVID world, but in any event, is at times to step back and have a look at the bigger picture, because lots of things are going on in the planning world, the housing strategy and building regulations and all those sorts of things, which all link together and have consequences for areas of thinking and areas of delivery. And one of the challenges which I've always felt was difficult for practitioners is to keep a grip, keep an eye on the bigger picture and how all these things interrelate. So what I'm going to try and do today in talking through these various, I was in the 15, 20 minutes that I've got, because frankly, I could have gone on for longer, but is to try and draw the context together and say why all these things matter, to try and perhaps set up the discussion for later and to set the scene for the other people. So where do I begin? I begin at the top, which is up-to-date plans. And it's always been the case. I mean, the government have talked about this being a plan-led system. It still is. And they still talk about having an up-to-date plan. And that's being seen as critical to the success of delivering through a plan. And it's interesting, whenever you talk to people, people will always acknowledge that having a plan is a good thing to have. Delivering through a plan, attracting investment through a plan is all, no one argues against that objective, which has always been it's always been a bit of a puzzle for me as to why then it's been such a, during my time as chief planner, such a challenge to try and make sure that local authorities had up-to-date plans. In 2008, when I became chief planner, I think the figures were around 18 to 20% of authorities had up-to-date plans. It rose depending on whether you counted 2012 as a threshold for changing what you were counting, it changed to be more like 84% before I left. But this plan is required because it needs to be based on evidence, and the local housing need and the housing delivery test are critical components of delivering housing in a plan. And although the government has argued and ministers did about simplifying the planning system, and there's a lot of merit in simplifying the way in which housing need was calculated. A lot of energy and money was expended on arguing whether methodologies were right and whether figures were right. And what the government's ambition was to try and have a clear view. Let's all agree what the figures are, so we can then have a debate about where they're going to go. Now, that is still a matter of controversy. You've seen how the latest algorithm was kicked back on, and they reverted to an older approach with a uplift in the 20 biggest cities. It's still an issue for housing delivery tests, where you look back over the last 3 years as a rolling program. And I think that you could argue that if you have an effective plan, an up-to-date plan, and you have a delivery which meets your housing delivery test, you don't need a 5-year land supply, do you? Because if you're delivering, then that's fine. But I think that for, as we see, when people are not delivering, then I think 5-year land supply, the figures and the housing delivery test are key components of a local plan. And it is interesting, you've only got to look at the example in Manchester, where if you look at the 10 authorities in Manchester and their combined delivery over the last 3 years, if you look at the housing delivery test results that came out a couple of weeks ago, they over-delivered as a group. They delivered more houses than they actually were required. But you still ended up with some of those authorities being regarded as presumption authorities and having to have action plans and the like. And so it goes to show how this system is still bedding in and needs to actually be more, in my view, more nuanced in its approach. So in looking at this and how this is going to amend, the government's come up with this white paper. It's talked about how the planning system will change, and I think the phrase I remember most about the presentations that were given at the time was big ideas that need big thinking. And I think that was right, because although there were lots of big ideas in there, and lots of people who read the white paper would have said that's lacking a bit in the detail, it's more green and white. But the idea about having a speedier planning system, local plans dealt with more quickly, the issue about what policies should be in plans, I think are all matters that practitioners would agree with, and this is all stuff that could actually have benefit. But whatever they come up with, whatever the new system is, you've still got the fundamentals, haven't you, in place? You've still got a plan. You've still got to have an up-to-date plan, and that's where your future ambition is going to start. So, as well as these big ideas, the government's had other approaches which I think are relevant, and that's why they're on the board. Widening the permitted development rights was part of the delivery, and pressing people to build up. And you'll have seen that's become a suburban issue as well as an urban issue, whilst there's people exhorted to have policies which say where people should build up. Quite recently, there was the street-by-street approach. And a wonderful drawing on the consultation, the report which led to the initiative, which talked about there was a street of bungalows and suddenly there was a street of what looked like Georgian mansions, and the idea that communities could be able to have a say in building up. And the argument being they would benefit financially from that sort of approach is one which knocks on to how PDR is seen and how permitted development rights work. And I should come back to that in a moment. For some, the idea of PDR is a sort of an inherent problem, because you have an ambition to plan for an environment post-COVID, but you have a PDR which takes away some of the elements which you feel you might need to plan for. So there are matters there which we might come back to and discuss. And in this mix of new ideas, the government pressing for beauty and the design codes and the idea that there'll be a fast track to beauty and that the planning system will deliver good outcomes by applying the design guidance and design codes, or local authorities applying them, because the National Design Code is a guide to do a code. It's not a code in itself, but it has good components. As I've said in the past, there used to be a design compendium, and much of the quality of that document is reflected in the new one. But it's hard to argue against the ambition of having the planning system deliver great places. And those, to my mind, to begin with, sets the context for they're the basic requirements. But the other points I've got on this slide reflect the fact that there's a recognition that things won't necessarily go back to how they were in before 2019, before COVID. So there are COVID consequences. And there are strong arguments that some of this is a good thing. I was just saying before we started the conference that having conferences like this, just a simple example, is great. You can put on a conference, you can talk to nearly 100 people, and I can do it from my sitting room in East London. I think that some of this sort of stuff is never going to go away. But there are other consequences which I want to talk about, which are perhaps a bit more significant than that. And the first of that is about sort of the health agenda. It's not just about cycling and gardens, but it does include that. The idea that we've all reflected on how we have been in this last year, and our mental well-being, our mental health, the access to public open space, the idea that actually gardens are not a bad idea, and having some space for yourself have all got to be things which I think come back to play when we start thinking about, well, what sort of places are we going to be creating, and how does that reflect in the sorts of design guides and codes that we're going to be making. And this homework environment, we've all been working from home. Some of us have found it difficult. Some of us found it easy. But the homes are not necessarily designed, are they, for us all to be working from home. So there's some issues about what sort of homes we are providing, whether we need to think about the space. And there have been benefits which have come accrued, which, thinking about it, were obvious, weren't they? But people commented on it straight away that air quality improved. Air quality improved in London. People have taken photographs across London and they said the air's never been so clear. Well, why? Well, because no one's driving the traffic, and people have taken up cycling, and the footpaths have been widened. Walking's easier, and so it's almost an "I told you so" moment where he said, "Well, these are issues which need to be addressed by reducing traffic and reducing the impact of the adverse effects of industry and the like on air quality." And there's a lot of buzz around 15-minute city in a 15 or 20-minute neighbourhood. And that's really quite interesting, because on the one hand, you can buy into that and think, well, yes, it'd be great if I could get everything I needed within a 20-minute walk or a quick cycle ride from where I live. I think that people are saying, yeah, wouldn't it be good if instead of commuting into the centre of town, I could sort of go down the high street and work in an office hub just down the corner, and then sort of go into work, say, perhaps 1 or 2 days a week. But as a counter to that, there was a really interesting blog which I read recently where the writer was arguing they're fed up with this idea. They've been living in a 15-second world where everything is on the internet. They shop on the internet, they work on the internet, they do conferences on the internet. Everything is 2 clicks away from their life. They're cooking in the same space. The kids are in the same space, and I think they can't wait to get back to the city. That great unknown entity where there's sort of a challenge and the like. And I think that there's it's been interesting to watch over the year a shift away from this is how it's going to be forever to people saying, well, no, I think I'll go back to work. And I think we'll end up somewhere in the middle. But it does have has a contextual influence about how we need to plan and how we need to think about the sorts of places that we're going to end up with in the future. Now, last 4 slides for me, 4 or 5 slides. I want to talk about the high streets. I think we talked about how things are changing significantly. Quite apart from the accessibility to neighbourhoods, there's an issue about their role in retailing. And this is really brought to the fore that I think it's been acknowledged that there's too much retail floor space in the country. On the other hand, the government has been committed to, quite rightly, in trying to protect and enhance and save the high street. And it's how that's going to play out in our thinking. And one of the issues, I said I'd come back to it, is the role that permitted development rights might play in that. So the emergence of Class E as a use, which is like a town centre use, and say, well, okay, rather than have all these different sorts of shops and different sorts of uses, A2, A1, and you know, the sort of business uses B2, let's have something that says anything in this class is okay in the town centre. And on the face of it, you can think that gives flexibility and the like, because you don't need planning permission to change within a class. It's not a change of use. Now, of course, that brings inherent challenges, because if you don't need planning permission, nothing to do with the planning system. People can change the use as they see fit. Now, that said, on the one hand, you get more pop-up, meanwhile uses, and people get more innovation. On the other hand, you know, the idea of there being, as set out in Chapter 7 of the NPPF, requirement on local planning authorities to plan for their high street becomes a little bit more difficult. Then add a PDR right over the top of that, which is being consulted on, of a change of use from Class E to residential, and it starts to say, well, in this post-COVID world, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And the answer may be it might be both. It just depends on where it's applied. The other issue, which I think is on this sheet, which is important, is building regulations. Building regulations are seen as the vehicle, the most obvious vehicle to tackle climate change, because as a set of regulations, they can specify what the building requirements are. But that's not to say that planning doesn't have a part to play, and I'm pleased to see the current NPPF consultation reintroduced some of the sustainable development goals. And I think that the requirement for planning to meet the climate change challenge is critical. I think it really needs to be at the heart of what we're thinking. And I think that goes beyond things such as green spaces and planting trees and tree-lined streets. As good as they are, it must go beyond that. And I think that's really going to be a challenge. And to conclude, really, my sort of the last 2 points is just to emphasise that don't forget that everything that we have in the plan, if we're going to have a plan-led system, it influences investment decisions. So you're trying to create a situation where investors have got confidence in the planning system, and it's important to remember that we're trying to achieve that. And one of my challenges is, does PDR help that confidence, or does it erode it? And I think that there's a debate to be had there. And then the final point, and the reason I put it into red, is throughout my career, the idea that planning is for people is something that I've remembered, and we do this because we're planning for where people want to live and how people want to live, and you're trying to make lives better. And I think that in a post-COVID world, given those bubbles that I put on there, and there may be more, and I haven't said this is an exclusive list. This is the list I wanted to highlight. That remember that when we're planning, we're not just planning for numbers. And although numbers are important, and I'm sure that when we come to Martin's speech, he'll talk about what's happening in Leeds. But don't forget, as well as meeting our numbers targets, we need to create places that meets the needs of the people we're planning for. And that's one of the things that I want to leave you with as a reminder. In all these, as all these bubbles start to interconnect, don't forget that we're planning for people. And Bradley, I'm going to close there and look forward to having a discussion about what other bubbles people might want to add to the sheet.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. So thank you for setting the issues really in context, but also for giving us the theme for the afternoon, which I think is that things are not going to go back to how they were, and in many ways we wouldn't want them to do that. So can I now ask Martin Elliot, the Head of Strategic Planning at Leeds City Council, to present, put up your slides if you're happy with that.
Thank you. Yes, I will. I'm just share my PowerPoint. Just bear with me. It seems to have disappeared. Well, it was working 2 minutes ago. Just bear with me. There we go. That's it. Excellent. I'll have to go back a little. There we go. Thank you for that. My name is Martin Elliot, and I am pleased to be here this afternoon. If you just bear with me one tick, I've just lost my notes, but don't worry, I'll plow on. This is one of the disadvantages of this. I really like a lot of things about working from home, but I don't like doing things like this and giving these presentations, because it is rather like, as Nietzsche said, staring into the abyss and the abyss staring back at you. But coincidentally, that's how I feel about planning for housing need sometimes, because it's been a torrid time in terms of this agenda over the last 10 years. And lots of people talk about some of the effects of the pandemic exacerbating trends that were already in place, as well as providing opportunities to improve things. So I think if I'm going to talk about housing post COVID-19, I will need to spend a bit of time talking about where we were, to see whether some of those lessons can be learned going forward. I'll also talk about the government's planning reforms, and I'll talk about, as Steve's just really nicely lined up for me, this isn't just about planning for numbers. It's not a technical exercise. This is a spatial endeavour as well. So we'll talk about places, and we'll talk about placemaking. And I'll talk about what Leeds is currently doing to what I call sharpen its policy tools to deliver better places and plan for the climate emergency. So just taking a look backwards, this is a slide that I think is really useful, and it captures, and it's often used by shelter. And the dotted red line is where the government want us to get to in terms of the number of homes built each year. And this is aggregated into 10-year blocks there, you'll see. And what you'll see is in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, when we had active private sector and local authority build working in tandem, that figure of 300,000 homes a year was perfectly achievable. But you'll see that as that local authority delivery tailed off at the end of the 1970s into the 80s, and basically at nothing really during the 2000s, we were far short of that target of 300,000. Now that wasn't because private enterprise, that was partly because local authority building had gone, but it was also because private enterprise just couldn't step up to fill that gap. You'll also see, for the eagle-eyed amongst you, a glint of green in the 2010s as local authority building is returning. So it is a numbers issue, but it's also a delivery issue as well. We're also told that delivering the number of homes this country needs is a political priority, but I always find it rather ironic that it's taken 17 different ministers of housing and planning since 2001 to come in, say it's a priority, and then leave without really providing one of the key things that planning needs to plan well for housing over the long term, and that's stability. We haven't had that stability in a long time, and one of the ways in which we've had an unstable approach to planning is in terms of, well, how does a local authority actually work out and assess how many homes it needs to build? This is a graph that shows the way that the government methodology for how local authorities should calculate the number of homes it needs has changed 4 times over the last 9 years. And you'll see in the blue, this is what the NPPF is asking us to do. And you'll see in the orange, that's kind of what Leeds kind of did in terms of its numbers. So we had pretty well aligned approach back in 2012. And that was fortunate because we were setting our core strategy at the time, our strategic plan for the delivery of our housing numbers. But what was really unfortunate was that when we actually came to do our site allocations plan, and find allocations for 66,000 of these homes, the numbers in the NPPF suddenly went down, then crept back up, and have continued to rise ever since. And that 2021 figure you see there is a reflection of the government's standard algorithm plus a 35% housing uplift, which it's placed on urban authorities. Now that has caused us as a council a massive problem because we haven't had the stability and the security that we need to plan properly for housing with any given number. Because if you can imagine, we've got lots and lots of landowners and developers who are really keen to release sites for housing, arguing for higher numbers, and we've got many residents who are arguing for lower numbers. So it has felt very much like, as a council, we're caught in the middle. And you'll note the length of that arrow for the site allocations plan. That's partly due to the continued change within government guidance, and we haven't quite finished that process yet. During that process as well, not knowing what you're planning for and not being able to plan for it and allocate it leaves you vulnerable. It leaves you vulnerable because if you haven't got a 5-year housing land supply, you can lose housing decisions on appeal. And these are some pictures of sites in Leeds that have been delivered on appeal. And they're not really very inspiring, are they? And this, I think, is what the numbers game looks like. You've got pretty uninspired, unusable green space. You've got car-dominated sites. And really, you don't have good housing quality. Now, it's not just us that's noticing that. Nationally, there's a problem. The English Housing Survey reported that 80% of homes, new homes being built in this country, were what they called mediocre. And it's not just the quality, it's actually the trust as well. Trust in planning is very low. Trust in private developers to act in an honest way. You see there that 89% of people either distrust or neither trust nor distrust developers. But you know, local authorities aren't much better. 86% of people there mistrust or neither trust nor mistrust local authorities and local councils to make decisions in the best interests of their area. So these things are all affecting how we think about post-pandemic. And I put this one up. This is a post that I did on LinkedIn. I'm not massively active on LinkedIn, but kind of a couple of weeks into the lockdown, about a year ago now, I put this post out and I thought, this is really about placemaking. We've got to build back better. I was lucky because I live in an area that's got wide pavements, it's got green space, it's got good infrastructure, it's got local shops. But many people don't. Many people are in houses with rooms that are too small. They aren't satisfying basic space standards. They're cut off, they're lacking services, they're lacking trees. And, you know, I'm not remotely trendy, but for one time in my life, I was trending. So I thought, well, you know, I'll live that again. I'll just put this out here for you to see. 19,000 views. So clearly other people thought, and other people were optimistic about what the future might bring and whether we could learn some lessons from the pandemic in terms of how we build. So did we? Have we? So what's the government got in mind through its planning reforms? It set out to do a root and branch review of the English planning system and started that with a planning white paper last year and has subsequently released other changes as well to the NPPF. This is a kind of pros and cons list, if you like. So on the one hand, the planning reforms are talking a lot more about beauty. They're not talking about placemaking, they're talking about beauty. But on the other hand, they're talking a lot more about deregulating the planning system and allowing for more permitted development. Now, with permitted development, you don't get planning control. So it's very difficult to actually get beauty with that. On the one hand, they're talking about affordable housing, but the affordable housing they're talking about is something called first homes, which is a 30% off market value. Now in Leeds, 30% off market value goes nowhere near to meeting any of the affordable needs that we have within our city, where 30% of the population only can afford to spend over £180,000 on a home. And our current affordable housing policy isn't looking for 30% discount, it's looking for 60% discount on market costs. It talks about community involvement, and it talks about that and talks about getting more people involved with planning their areas, which within Leeds as an authority that's got over 17 made neighbourhood plans, I think we'd subscribe to that and be really keen to see that happen. But on the other hand, there's a greater centralism. We've already talked about the government centralising housing numbers through its standard methodology, but they're also talking about centralising some development management control policies as well. On the one hand, the planning reform really welcomely talks about the sustainable development goals that the UN sets out, that really captures the sort of the broad spatial perspective of planning in its widest reach, not just about technical numbers, but about, as Steve Quartermain just said, people's lives, people's life chances, and people's health and well-being. But on the other, there's still a very unclear purpose of planning. There's a very unclear understanding of where within the balance of net gains that the NPPF talks about any of these things actually lie, including things like climate change. The government doesn't really take the opportunity within the NPPF to clarify the status of climate change within planning, or that it is one of its most fundamental objectives to plan for, given that it is actually a legal objective of the planning system. And on the other hand, on the one hand, again, it talks about strategic planning, but not in any great detail. That's to be decided. And it's worth noting that back in 2009, before we've had a decade of the fewest houses built since the 1950s, the government had within its control 8 plans that set housing targets, lined them up with industrial employment strategies, aligned that with infrastructure provision and environmental policies. But unfortunately, they were at a regional level and they were abolished in 2010. The other thing that the planning reforms set out is a new means of looking at viability. Now, this I think is particularly worrying, because I think one thing that I think the government had done well and started to clarify and started to stabilize was the way we thought about viability. FBHM is fixing the broken housing market, and the Fixing the Broken Housing Market white paper was actually rather good, because it didn't bash planners for a start. It actually laid the fault of the lack of delivery of housing and housing quality at the housing market, and it sought to remedy that by looking at better ways to encapsulate land value capture and make developer contributions clearer and simpler and more robust. And that was all about clarity, because developers will tell you that what they need is clarity. Investors will tell you that what they need is clarity, and they need that clarity to last, so that they can make the deals on the land and they know exactly what's expected of them when they come into the local authority to get their planning permission, and that everyone understands what's expected of them. And very simply, within the NPPF 2019, which was implemented as part of the previous white paper, that was about setting what's the existing use value of the land, what profit do you expect, what policies have you got to pay for, what betterment, in other words, is the local authority requiring. So therefore, you know exactly what you pay for the land. Too often, that's not the case. Too often, the policy is either so changeable, not helped by changes to national guidance, so that developers simply don't know what those policy expectations are or take a punt that they're going to change. So therefore, you have either developers who will turn up at plan making examinations and say that their schemes are viable, only to turn around at the planning application stage and say that their schemes are unviable. And the planning system really can't deal with that. That delays development decisions, and that delay to development decisions doesn't necessarily get blamed on anybody other than the local authority who is not making that decision within 8 or 13 weeks. The planning reforms worryingly change that. And I think that's the key thing. They're changing that system that everyone, I think, was starting to implement. I'm concerned that that will lead to less certainty within the realms of viability. I'm also concerned that there isn't a reflection of the difficulty in bringing forward brownfield land and the difficulty in bringing forward development within the north of England, which is based on very different viabilities to the southeast. So that's the context. That's kind of where we've been and what the government's proposing. So what are we doing? Well, what we've been doing actually is enjoying the fact that we've now got a 5-year housing land supply. And that's given what I describe as the ability to sharpen the tools we've got. We've done that certainly through a lot of work in terms of linking the planning for housing alongside planning for health and well-being. And you can see there, and you can Google that and have a look at that document, which is about lining up planning and health together. And a lot of the ways, the technical ways in which planning and health get lined up together and implemented on sites is contained within this Placemaking for Resilient Communities document. Now that's a bit of a toolkit. And the links on the slide, and hopefully you can have these slides later and look at your leisure. And that really pulls together a lot of the design work that the council has about layout. So it's not about simply thinking, I've got a site, I need to squeeze this many houses into it. How do I do that and get away with a planning permission for this many houses? It's about, right, you've got a site, you want to put housing on it. How do you think about the green infrastructure links of this site? How do you think about the wider context of this site? What's the layout of this site? How can you fit in green infrastructure benefits, which are often cheaper than grey infrastructure? Open, sustainable urban drainage, for example, rather than concrete underground drainage. So we're feeling more confident as an authority, I think, in terms of pushing some of these things now that we have a 5-year supply. And some of these things are coming to bear on schemes like Kirkstall Forge, which is to the west of the city, with things like pocket parks and well integrated green space, through things like the city centre. And the city centre in Leeds is really having a renaissance at the moment, with an awful lot of planning permissions and development going into the city centre. And this one in particular really looking at sustainable development, carbon efficiency, embedded within a really good green setting. But it's not just developers who are doing this. There's different ways that schemes are coming forward as well. And we've got this example of a community build scheme by a group called Lilac within the inner area. And as I mentioned at the very start, with the reduction in local authority build really constraining the ability to hit those targets. But we're getting there. We're getting back on track. Nowhere near the numbers that we were hitting before. It's about 300 a year through the council's housing growth programme. And those dwellings are being brought forward with a real focus on space and utility to make the rooms big enough. And we know post-COVID that large rooms are really important, not least because if you've now got to work in a room as well as sleep in a room, and if it's not just you that's working in a room, but your kids need to work in their bedrooms, you do need that additional space. But it's also about high standards of energy efficiency, biodiversity, and a rent which is reasonable, a rent which is based on 30% of the local average income rather than the market price. We're also gearing up for a local plan update. We've already got a climate, a core strategy, which has many policies around climate change, but they were to meet climate change targets that have now been ramped up, and the authority as a whole is aiming to be net zero by 2030. So we're about to go out to consultation on a regulation 18 consultation, which is the first stage of consultation on policies on adaptation and mitigation around the things listed there. And it's important that we're doing that as a whole, because they then form a package. Because if we're talking about placemaking sits at the heart of carbon efficiency, green infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, and flood risk. So all of these elements of the local plan update, we'll be able to show people what places will look like in the future. So rather than actually say we're going to build this many houses in this area, we can have a conversation about this is the sort of housing development that we're aspiring to build within Leeds. Do you like that? Do you not like that? Do you think that meets your needs or not? So just a few conclusions to wrap up. I think as we move forward and as we plan post-COVID, we really do need to re-emphasize that planning is a broad spatial endeavor. It helps deliver things like the health agenda. It helps deliver the inclusive growth agenda. When used as a narrow regulatory land use tool, I think it frustrates quality placemaking. And the last decade, where there's been a focus simply on numbers, it really hasn't worked. We simply haven't ramped those numbers up and built what we need to build. Planning can front load viability. There are viability concerns. I'm fully aware of that. But what planning can do is front load those. It can assist in land value capture, and it can de-risk bringing forward better quality housing for investors if it is consistently allowed to do so. And consistently allowed to do so means not ever changing government policy, but a consistency of government policy, which actually has government support and advocacy for the business of planning, rather than the continual criticism that planning is doing it wrong. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. Thanks for that example of how a local authority can build back better, but also for setting out the problems. How do you plan for housing need when only 30% of the city's population can afford market prices? And how do you plan for housing placemaking, health and well-being against a context of deregulation and lack of certainty in policy? So let's take a closer look at some of those housing policies and housing targets. And if I can ask Justin Gartland from Lichfields to take the stand, a virtual stand, and Justin, if you'd like to present.
Thank you very much. I shall try and upload it now. Oh, I think, have you got that?
Not yet. Do you have to click on a choice of options for your screen? I think. Okay.
Where are we? Always was going to be potentially a problem. Right. I think I may have too many.
Do you want me to share it for you?
Can you do it?
Yep, sure.
Quentin, it's just not playing ball at the moment.
Okay. Okay, can you see those?
Yep, can see him, Quentin.
Yep.
Yeah.
I can
Okay.
see it.
Great.
Just need to. Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, if I can start then, Quentin, and I hope everybody can hear me. But yes, my name's Justin Gartland, and I run the Yorkshire office of Lichfields, which is a national planning consultancy, and we act and give planning advice to local authorities in the Yorkshire area, including Wakefield, Sheffield, Craven, and Leeds as well, and also act for the developers and house builders active in the area as well. And in terms of housing, looking at housing in city centre and mid-urban environments, as well as on greenfield sites on urban peripheries. So covering a lot of the spatial areas of the housing sector. If you could move to the next slide, please, Quentin. I just wanted to cover in my presentation today three areas, and I'll try and keep as close to the brief in relation to dealing with the post-COVID aspects of this. I wanted to start just by taking a Yorkshire focus on picking up the points that Steve made at the beginning related to the importance of a local plan and the delivery against need for housing in the region. And then I wanted to focus on the spatial aspects of some of that related to two approaches in Leeds and Bradford, in particular dealing with how the anecdotal responses we get about how people want to live their lives in a post-COVID environment may play out in planning. And then finally, with less of a focus on housing, really looking at the high streets, again, that Steve touched on. And we're looking at a couple of specific examples that we're involved in on repurposing high streets. So if we can start with the next slide, Quentin, please. The sector, and strangely enough, it was a sector that suffered really quite badly in the economic downturn from 2007-8 onwards. And when the pandemic hit, there was a bit of a wobble in the housing sector, and some of us thought, oh, here we go again, not another 2009-10 era, but happily the housing sector has proven itself to be very resilient over the pandemic period, and house building has continued. Investment in housing and the search for permissions by the housing industry has continued. As Martin pointed out, the government's target for 3 million, that says 300,000, should be three the homes a year remains the target. And Steve also touched upon the controversy around the standard methodology, which has caused a certain amount of high-level discussion, certainly in the industry, but has now really sort of landed, I think, on a position whereby the government has adjusted what turned out to be, I suppose, the unintended consequences of relying on an algorithm, whereby housing was directed away from urban areas into suburban and rural areas more. And the reaction of the government to that, rightly or wrongly, and it is an issue for of some debate, is to add the 35% uplift to the major urban centres, 20 major urban centres in the country. And part of that was to deal with also the levelling up agenda as well, with a large number of those areas being in the north of the country. Now, in terms of how that pans out for the planning authorities in the Yorkshire region and nationally, the two controls that the government applies to housing delivery is to try and keep authorities honest, is to try and persuade and cajole authorities to get a local plan in place. as quickly as they can. Steve reported on the progress that had been made during his tenure at the ministry, and a large number of authorities now have local plans in place, but also a significant number don't. So the two interventions used by the government to make sure that housing is delivered are the housing delivery test, which is a backwards looking tool, and the 5-year housing land supply, which is a forward looking tool. And failure to perform well against each of these controls results in essentially penalties being applied in one way or another to the council in terms of its ability to resist development where otherwise it might want to resist that development. So if you can move on to the next slide, Quentin, I'd just like to show a graphic of Yorkshire indicating the results of the 2020 housing delivery test results, which look backwards over the performance of these authorities for the last 3 years against their housing requirements, either in an up-to-date local plan or, if there isn't one, on the standard method. And you can see that the majority of authorities in Yorkshire perform well, and there's no penalty being applied to them. But areas where there is a colour other than green, there's showing the sliding scale of adjustment requirement that has to be applied in those areas, and that varies from an action plan having to be drawn up by that authority to explain how it will go about remedying the delivery failure, to a 20% buffer being applied on a calculation of 5-year housing land supply to make it easier essentially for a developer to get himself into a position, or herself into a position, where they can seek to apply a presumption in favour of sustainable development on a particular scheme to an automatic presumption in favour of sustainable development. And here in Yorkshire, the only authority where that applies as a result of the last HDT results was Calderdale. Now, of these authorities, and going back to Steve's point about the importance of having a local plan in place, Bradford is in the process of consulting on a new local plan. York is at examination on a plan and is stalling and hasn't had a plan in place since the 50s, and Calderdale is also struggling to get its local plan in place. And so there's a direct link you can see between the adoption of a local plan and the ability to be delivering housing in a consistent way and meet the needs of the area. So next slide, please, Quentin. And talking about the COVID impacts now, as I said, there was a bit of a wobble in terms of the house building's maintenance of housing delivery as a result of the pandemic. And this time last year, really, for a couple of months, it looked like sites were closing and developers were starting to slacken off on their delivery. Now that was a mixed picture. Some house builders did shut down sites, but the vast majority didn't. And then even those that did reopened pretty soon after June last year. And what's been very, very reassuring is to see the maintenance of housing delivery through that period. The housing market has been very active. People have been buying and selling houses, and new build houses have been snapped up. So the sector remains healthy. So in an overview sense, the housing sector does look like a largely an unaffected one by the pandemic, in stark contrast to retail and town centres, which I'll come on to at the end. And there are a couple of examples there as to why there might be an impact on 5-year housing land supply and ultimately delivery, and an impact on the housing delivery test itself next time round as a consequence of the pandemic. And there was a period where planning permissions were being delayed because local authorities were having to readjust to working at home, etc. The inflexibility of being able to deal with planning conditions, even the nuts and bolts issues around PPE equipment needed for site working, etc. So these all have an impact. And the next slide, if I can, Quintin, will show an example of where the housing delivery test, if we modelled a delay on housing delivery of a 3-month and a 6-month period into the projected results of a housing delivery test, for example, next year, you would see some authorities moving from, for example, Kirklees moving from a 20% buffer into a presumption in favour, ditto Rotherham, and ditto York. So it theoretically, the COVID, even a short interruption in the housing delivery that some authority areas may have experienced during the initial phase of the COVID epidemic may have a follow-through implication in terms of the housing delivery test. And also, if we move to the next slide, thank you, Quintin, on 5-year housing land supply. And similarly, you can see there local authorities that have a marginal 5-year housing land supply position could be tipped into having not a 5-year housing land supply, and then having the presumption in favour of sustainable development applied to development management decisions in those areas. And those authorities close to that position include Barnsley, East Riding, Rydale and Sheffield, for example, York already being well under, as is Bradford and Calderdale, those 3 authorities I mentioned last time out without their local plans in place. So that's the picture, if you like, across the region in terms of how authorities are meeting their need, and certain authorities struggling to do so, and the relationship to having a local plan in place. Moving on to an example of how this 2 particular areas can be differentiated in terms of the way they are providing housing to meet their needs. The situation in Leeds, touched upon by Martin, was that the site allocations plan has gone through a fairly tortuous process to get to adoption and was legally challenged, the consequence of which is that the former Greenbelt allocations in the plan are proposed to be removed, which, as a matter of pure mathematics, if you like, does therefore increase the reliance on city centre sites and inner urban area sites to meet the district-wide housing needs. And if we move on to the next slide, please, Quintin, you can see at the bottom what I've done here is to just show and be a bit careful with interpreting this slide, because we've tried to sort of match up areas that have some sort of spatial commonality between the 2 cities. But you can see with the inner area of Leeds and the city centre, the proportion of the district-wide supply is 58%, and that is quite a high proportion. And I'm going to come on to a point about this really related to economics, because what Leeds is managing to do and seems to be thriving, and some of the schemes Martin put up are examples of that, and some of the schemes we're working on are examples of this in the city centre, is a continued hunger and enthusiasm for city centre apartments and other forms of housing being developed, and a very large number are in for planning or about to be in for planning as we speak, which is supporting the delivery of city centre apartments. And we're told anecdotally that as a result of COVID and the working from home experience, that city centre living is less popular. People are after houses with its own amenity space, houses with gardens. It may well be the case, but it's certainly not at the moment not showing up in a reduction in the appetite for city centre housing developments in Leeds. Bradford, on the other hand, is quite different. There seems to be very little enthusiasm for similar types of city centre residential development there, and based as much on viability of being able to deliver that sort of city centre development. Only 25% of Bradford's overall supply is proposed within its city centre, and in terms of an equivalence of Leeds and the inner area, 31% is proposed, with releases of greenbelt land in Bradford designed to provide for 5,500 dwellings, which is very different to a position in Leeds where those greenbelt sites have actually been withdrawn from the plan. So quite a different spatial approach. And now going back to the 35% centres uplift that the government has applied to the standard method, and how that might affect those two areas. Well, Leeds will have to accommodate that within its figure, and you saw that graph from Martin showing that, and that will play out in the review ultimately of Leeds's local plan. But my understanding of the figures, which is reasonably good for Leeds, is that they're actually overshooting their city centre target at the moment. So that's going to help with their ability to accommodate that 35% uplift. Bradford, however, have a very different problem because they've already established through their local plan the limited ability of the urban area to accommodate dwellings. So they may well be in a position where, as a result of their 35% uplift requirement, their annual housing requirement of 1,700 approximately dwellings per annum goes to 2,300 dwellings per annum. And that might be an explanation as to why Bradford's local plan, which is out for consultation at the moment, in fact its consultation finished yesterday on the publication draft, does not accept the government's proposition of a 35% uplift in its housing figure. In fact, it rejects it, it doesn't include it, and the city is clearly heading for a bit of a battle on that, because it's the first authority to respond to the government's 35% uplift requirement, and it's refused to do so. Next slide, please. Thank you, Quintin. And just moving on, and I wanted to look at a couple of examples that do touch on housing, but they're two town centre schemes where we are either actively or tangentially involved in. One being at Stockton, where the council has reacted to the changes to retail in the town centre, and we were commissioned along with others to produce a master plan for the town centre last year relating to the Castlegate shopping centre, which was a 1970s designed shopping centre by and built by the renowned Paulson, who ended up in prison for his various interventions in planning and misdemeanours. But the proposal that plan proposes is for the removal entirely of that shopping centre and the creation of an open space and linking the town centre with the river, which as a result of 70s road building and other developments have been totally isolated from the town centre, and the introduction of performance areas, pop-up shops, etc., and a land bridge over the road to allow people to get to the river and have a promenade along the riverfront, and dare I say it, the Martin's Class E uses peppered about to introduce a degree of flexibility about what activities can happen in units around the edge of that new urban park. We've just been instructed to submit a planning application on that now, so Stockton means it. Whether the money will be around to actually implement it in due course, well, that remains to be seen. But the Borough Council are quite serious about implementing this. And the other example I had just to speak to was the Broadmarsh Centre in Nottingham, another interesting example. And both of these are quite extreme ends of what's happening in, or what planning for the changes in the retail sector might be. Broadmarsh Centre was owned by Intu, one of our clients, long-term clients. They used to be called Capital Shopping Centres. They went bust last year, unfortunately, and left that development half demolished. And ownership of it has reverted to the City Council, who have gone out on a consultation exercise locally to see what the people of Nottingham would like done with the space. And a number of responses have come back, but generally the favoured approach seems to be for a large urban park with interspersed with some small shops, a market, some vertical farming opportunities and some housing. The leader of the council particularly excited by the prospect of a new urban park with wildflower meadows introduced right in the heart of Nottingham city centre. Very extreme reactions perhaps to the change in the retail sector, but interesting nonetheless, and demonstrates how planning is moving in a whole new direction in terms of how we might want to use our town centres in the future. Hard economics comes in with all of these, of course, and a number of the examples that we have around reuse of closed department stores, etc., which has been a real feature over the last year. Thank you, Quintin. I'm anticipating the final slide I've got, which is just showing you two of the big names that have gone to the wall over the last few months. I mean, 120 Debenhams stores will close this year. 11 House of Fraser stores closed since August 2018. We've got 8 John Lewis stores closing. Even before all this happened, this is a continuation of a trend. Obviously, in 2016, 164 British Home stores closed. Now, many of these stores will just never be used at the scale they were previously used, and many of them are being divided up for other uses now. For example, the House of Fraser stores in Birmingham, Lincoln, and Exeter have been converted into hotels, shops, and offices. In Reading, a food hall, bowling alley, and crazy golf. And the House of Fraser in Edinburgh is proposed to be a whisky attraction. Must go there. And then the Bristol House of Fraser has been snapped up to be converted into student accommodation. So all sorts of different uses being proposed for specific ex-retail buildings where the economics of the change of use can justify that. But it would be interesting to see whether the changes that are associated with these large-scale regeneration of a town centre with a loss of a huge shopping centre will be seen through to the full vision that people like Stockton and Nottingham envisage. That brings me to the end of my presentation, so thank you very much for listening to that.
Thank you very much indeed, Justin. Just wait for you to turn your microphone off. That's great. Okay, thanks very much for that. So a picture there, increased housing targets for urban areas and 2 potential outcomes locally, at least loss of greenbelt in Bradford or more apartment building in Leeds city centre, and the opportunities or possible threats of the hollowing out of the high street, the major department stores, the threat perhaps being permitted development, but the opportunities. Justin looked at Stockton and Nottingham, and there's potentially kind of the sort of vision that we might actually want to see. So introduce my final speaker. Steve referred to a blog from Urbanistas, the Women's Architectural Network, about the 15-second neighbourhood, which was the care responsibilities, particularly for women, in everything being in the home and in the next room. So here's Jessica Spencer from Urbanistas Northwest to give us some real issues to think about. Thank you very much, Jessica.
Thank you, Quentin. Thank you for inviting us to speak today. Hopefully I'm going to touch on a few of the topics that have been mentioned already. I'll just bring my screen up. And then also come at it from a sort of different perspective. So can you see my slides there?
Yes, you can see them.
Yeah.
Yep.
Fantastic. So just to introduce myself, my name is Jessica Spencer. I'm an architect living and working in Manchester, and I'm a core member of the Urbanistas NW group, who are a professional advocacy group for women in the built environment. So to introduce Urbanistas NW to you all, as you may not have heard of us, and I'm coming to this presentation sort of from my position as an architect, as well as my position as an urbanista. I will quote our manifesto. So our aspiration is to shape our environment into a more equitable and diverse arena, creating a professional landscape that reacts to and reflects the successes and challenges we face. We try to challenge the typical white middle-class male heavy dialogue within our profession, share our experiences, and shine a light on unrepresented people and ideas, with the aim to enable diverse conversations and allow the new generation of professional women in our industry to flourish. One sec, sorry, I'm having a problem with my slides. So we do this by focusing on events and discussions around networking, mentoring, and sharing stories. So if you want to find out a bit more about us, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Urbanistas NW, which I should have put in big letters on my slides, but anyway. So coming to this presentation about post-COVID housing, I would say COVID has undoubtedly changed the way we design spaces. The show of resilience and ability to quickly switch to home working when required has demolished previously perceived notions of how and where we need to work. As a result, and rightly so, a lot of designers are rethinking how we design and what's important. So I'd say when we design, we begin with a set of assumptions about how and why the spaces are going to be used. A lot of the time, these are unconscious assumptions based on personal experience and what we've been taught. But when 71% of ARB registered architects are male and only 1% of ARB registered architects are black, that suggests a set of binary, singular assumptions and experiences. So during this talk today, I would ask you to question, where do your own assumptions and biases lie, and how can you challenge them? So when I personally think about designing, I try to start from my own position and experience, and then identify the gaps and discrepancies between my experience, what general assumptions we make in the office, and what others different to myself may need. So talking about experience with COVID, I thought I'd start by just giving you a sort of brief introduction to my own personal experience. So this is my desk that I've been working in since March last year. So I very quickly had to appropriate my dining room table in my 2-bed flat that I share with my partner in Ancoats. Each Friday night I would remove my large screen, as you can see here, webcam, keyboard, all the office supplies from said table, and reset it back to how it used to be, because I didn't want to be staring at work all weekend long. Also, we had nowhere to eat. Our coffee table was also folded away to create a makeshift home workout area / jigsaw station. And at first I found it all quite novel and relaxing. So my working at home setup, plus the lack of much better to do, made it very easy to log overtime to meet a planning deadline over the Easter weekend last year. By July, I was exhausted from constantly being around my work, not taking any holiday days, and not gaining respite through my usual escapades. I think myself and a lot of people have had the opportunity to rethink and redesign what they want out of their home, their life, and their future. So when I think about what I'd want out of my home and what I need and how I use it, you know, it's become somewhere to work, somewhere to relax, somewhere to perform homemaking activities, to virtually socialise, to exercise, to have space for myself, and space mainly to be happy, healthy and safe. So, what did I do to reflect my changing priorities? Well, for starters, like so many people, I got a dog. And I'm not just saying this just so I could show you a picture of my dog. But because I would never have dreamed we could have got a dog before, but COVID made it possible. And I think for so many people, their priorities and goals have changed, and that will be reflected in what they want out of the built environment. So work-wise, jobs in the office were slowing down. An office building I was working on last year was put indefinitely on hold, so I was moved around the office assisting different people. I've since moved on to a residential project, which has seen a quick change around from the client, with post-COVID living at the forefront of everyone's mind. We very quickly added balconies into the scheme and allocated space for home working. Everything was reviewed with a fresh lens, and we defined what post-COVID buildings needed to include, creating a framework for clients to work from. So this is my personal experience for the past year, and I've been very lucky. Everyone's experience will have been different, and we need to be mindful of this when we move forward. Post-COVID housing is a big question. A lot of proposed solutions have asked for more space for living and working at home. I think a rethink of how we use and interpret the space standards is definitely required. But also more so that housing needs to be flexible, not necessarily bigger. Another thing to bear in mind is that COVID has exposed the stark inequalities within our society and has proven them deadly. Care work, once hidden in the private space of the home, is now front and centre within the work environment, with screaming kids becoming the background music for everyone's Zoom calls. My aforementioned dog likes to cry when I'm having meetings sometimes, so I know how that feels. And with school closed, the care responsibilities disproportionately fell onto women, low-paid workers, minority groups and immigrants. So when I've been preparing this presentation, I keep coming back to the Virginia Woolf quote: "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction," which I think succinctly summarises the disparities of experience that have been felt during the pandemic. And I think we need to think on this as we're creating housing post-COVID. But what we need is to create communities, not just meet housing building targets. So as I've touched on, the concept of home isn't working for many, and home will be different for everyone. You just think of all the different living situations: nuclear families, people cohabiting, people living alone, multi-generational living, students who definitely weren't considered and have been failed by the COVID restrictions, care homes and many more. It isn't an oasis of relaxation or the fun palace that your unconscious assumptions may conjure. It's a tangled mess of paid and unpaid work and sometimes difficult family life. The nuclear family isn't an effective tool, and it's not reflective of how the majority of people live. I got this little statistic from the ONS website. I found it quite interesting, actually. The number of households and the size of them, it's quite evenly split between 1, 2, 3, and 4 or more. So it just proves that, it's not, the nuclear family isn't the be all and end all when we're thinking about homes and designing housing, and we need to look at other notions of home and the family if we're going to create more successful housing. So here I'd like to quote Leslie Kern, who wrote this great book, The Feminist City, where she suggests that we look at housing and the concept of home as a series of binaries, traditionally public and private, home and work. And we know now more than ever that this isn't representative of how we've been living. And she asks us to question what power relations are maintained through these binaries and how we can challenge them. Another thing that comes to mind is that we also need to be mindful of situations where the home isn't safe. And as we have seen with the domestic violence cases surging during the national lockdowns, we need to ensure that alternatives are available so that nobody is trapped in a dangerous home situation. Home is an interconnected system with different layers required to provide support and protection. I think this issue of safety, again, has been brought to the forefront by the emptying out of city centres following the shutdown of all the main infrastructure that is there. So for me, walking around Manchester at night has become more and more intimidating, with the lack of life and the lack of open bars, restaurants and shops. And the recent Sarah Everard story is further evidence that makes women question their safety in the city. We need to untangle this relationship and create initiatives to challenge these unconscious assumptions about who space belongs to make sure everyone feels safe. The pandemic has shown how essential care work is to our society and how underfunded and difficult it can be. Our economy is built on the assumption that unpaid labour will be undertaken within the home. Care is devalued and feminised, disproportionately placing the burden on to women to undertake the double shift of paid and unpaid labour. We need to redistribute this, invest in public care services. Designing spaces with care in mind would make a big difference in times of crisis, not just on improving quality of lives, but also in aiding recovery by boosting the economy. Post-COVID, people of means, as we've talked about previously, people of means are moving out of the city in droves, searching for their own piece of green space. I mean, I'm really not surprised. In Manchester city centre, where I live, the lack of green space has become very apparent this past summer, with the vast number of people that have been gathering on like the only patch of grass near where I live, breaking social distancing rules, dumping their rubbish and becoming a public nuisance. And this bit of green space is actually set to be developed upon in the next year. So if we're locked down again without access to this space, I think a lot of people will struggle. It's become a social area, it's become a makeshift gym, it's become a space for respite and relax, to people to get out of the houses. And I've just put this picture in from the Manchester Evening News of Quartermain Square in Ancoats during May last year. Again, to show you all the people sort of craving this outdoor space and having nowhere else to go and breaking the social distancing rules as a result. But I do fear that if everyone moves out of the city centre, it's just going to create a host of new problems within the built environment. So Betty Friedan coined the problem that had no name in the 1960s to describe the women who were brought up to aspire to be homemakers. But once they achieved this, they found themselves still frustrated with not being able to fulfill themselves. And you might assume that the decades of feminist movement since then means that this problem doesn't exist anymore. However, I would say, how different are our suburbs now compared to 60 years ago? They were and still are built upon the assumptions of a nuclear family and will hinder attempts to manage different family shapes and working lives through their isolation, the standardised sizing of the family home, the need for multiple vehicles and the demands of childcare. And this will continue to push women out of the workplace and into lower paying or part-time jobs to juggle their family responsibilities. And this is compounded by the gender pay gap. That means it makes little sense for male members of a household to limit their earning potential. So as architects, when we're designing houses in the future, our personal COVID experience will be fresh in our minds. And we each have these unconscious values and norms that inform placemaking, as I mentioned earlier. So I would ask you to keep stopping and questioning where do your own biases lie. And some things that I found quite interesting to look towards as we move forward would be something like the gender mainstreaming policies that we see a lot in Vienna and across Sweden. So for those of you that are not familiar, gender mainstreaming is where every planning policy and budget decision has to be considered within the wider goal of gender equality. And it's actually now part of the UN goal for sustainable development. And an early example of this is the Frauen Werkstatt Woman Work City housing development in Vienna, where gender mainstreaming was tested out. And the scheme was characterised by a women's perspective at every level, with flexible layouts, widening corridors for pram storage, and eyes on the street to make sure that everyone felt safe and kids could roam about and play. And the scheme was so successful, they built a farm work strat too. So I do think with gender mainstreaming policies, their main success is in getting different perspectives considered, rather than using the default assumption that we always have. Although you do have to be mindful that you're not perpetuating existing gender stereotypes with these policies. And then another concept I find quite interesting that was Steve mentioned earlier is the 15-minute cities, because it turns the attention away from looking inward at the home to solve all your problems to a more outward facing the wider community. So as we previously mentioned, the idea is to improve your quality of life by creating cities where every resident's needs can be reached within a quarter of an hour by foot or bike. So as someone who has access to all their basic necessities within 15 minutes of their home, I can vouch that this situation is ideal. And I would say that Ancoats, actually, in Manchester, which is where I live, is an example of the 15-minute city, which then also shows all the sort of issues that you might have with it, because Ancoats now has become massively gentrified and people are more and more being pushed out as the homes get more and more expensive. So I think we need to make sure that we, when we're enacting the 15-minute cities, we do view it through the lens of gentrification to ensure that it can be a benefit to all. So, ideas. This past year has shown our communities can rally together and support each other with the rise of mutual aid groups. These people are out there and we need to engage and listen. If we want success, we need to build communities, not just houses. And one issue I've not really had a chance to touch on in the rest of my presentation is the inevitable focus on economic recovery and how we can have a green recovery. And I don't see how we can address some of the issues I've actually mentioned when housing is majoritively built for profit. I think you've previously touched on it earlier in some of the other presentations. And I think I would echo that housing is a necessity, it's not a luxury. And we do need to see it that way. And when you're looking at sort of the financing of housing, there's a whole raft of issues that need to be reviewed and worked through, such as land value and land speculation, which makes building on undeveloped plots more and more unaffordable. And the large amount of vacant housing stock that is concentrated in certain areas as housing is used for investment purpose. And with the recent changes to building regulations post-Grenfell and the massive retrofitting required, I fear the number of empty properties is only going to rise in the next year. And from where I live, actually, I can see outside my window, there's a brand new flat that has never been occupied in the 2 years since it was completed. Not to mention the several empty properties that are in my building. So I feel like this is a problem that we need to think through and think about solutions to address. So just to wrap up my presentation on some ideas, I think an important thing that we could do is to physically test ideas through building, not just competitions, in a flexible, non-precious, non-expensive way to get successful results. And we need to build for somebody in mind, not speculating what our imagined modular man may or may not want in his luxury home. A good architecture is when the design ethos is inherent within the building. It can't be value engineered out. We can create decent, affordable homes when the design is led by designers and policy and not driven by profit. A multi-scalar approach will be needed to meet the needs of our varied communities and provide the required supporting infrastructure. And I feel we can only do this successfully by giving agency to our communities and working together. And finally, we desperately need to invest in care services if we're going to make any of this accessible for all. And thank you. That's the end of my presentation. Just turn my screen off.
Thank you very much indeed, Jessica. Thanks for that thought-provoking presentation and for reminding us that housing need is more than just about numbers and housing targets. Housing policy should be about creating equality and justice as well as creating homes and communities. So we've got about half an hour for questions now, and at this point I'd like to bring in Donna, who's been monitoring the chat. Donna, would you like to take a couple of questions from early on in the chat if you can? And then,
So we've got one here. Where are the biggest challenges for affordability? Is it land cost, developer margin, or construction cost? What would you suggest doing to address this?
Okay, so I don't know if is Martin still here, or have we got David Feeney instead? Maybe Martin and David and Justin would like to take that question.
I'll start, Quintin. It's David Feeney,
Lovely.
Leeds City Council Chief Planning Officer speaking. I think it's a very important question, isn't it? And I think it's a question that cuts across all of those issues, actually. There are issues around land acquisition costs, issues around developer margin, and also construction costs. And I think in terms of tackling it head on, you know, that those factors fundamentally need to change in some way in order to unlock the need and the rate of delivery of affordable housing. I think whilst colleagues were speaking with the presentations, which I found all of them really helpful, I was just reflecting on the question about affordable housing. And I think one of the issues is that structurally, in my view, since we had the right to buy of council properties in the 1980s, I don't think there's ever been a rate of affordable house building which has kept pace with the rate at which former council houses were built. And I think the consequence of that has been that when the new methods for affordable housing have come through the planning system, they've never been able to deliver at the same scale or pace as former council housing. So personally, I feel that there's a major structural issue here, and it does need some fundamental re-engineering, I think, and something, you know, you would hope that the planning white paper could address. And certainly in Leeds, we've had a number of issues in terms of delivery. You know, we have various policies for affordable housing, but I think, as Martin said, we did a lot of work at the plan making stage in terms of the core strategy in looking at district-wide viability. But we've found that when individual planning applications have come in, there are issues with regard to the affordability of particular housing schemes, and that in part is linked to the type of housing that is being built, and it's also linked to the funding model that the investors have taken, and also issues around land acquisition costs and perhaps a legacy of land values which have fed into the subsequent planning application process. So there are a number of issues, but I think what it does demonstrate, though, building a high housing target doesn't necessarily result in a higher level of affordable housing, because I think of those inherent issues within the system. So I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
It does. Thank you very much indeed. Let's take another question, Donna.
Yeah, we've looks like we've got a little bit of a question followed by a small debate going on from the back of this, so I'll read this one out. Great to see an inclusion of inequalities in the conversation today. To what extent do the panel think the planning system is equipped for post-COVID cities to respond to calls to tackle inequalities highlighted during the pandemic, including race, gender and poverty, and what can we as planners do to respond?
So can we pass that to Steve, first of all, and then possibly Jessica might want to add something to it.
It's a good question. I think the answer is in two parts, really. I think planners have always been in a position to tackle this, and listening to Jessica, I was reflecting myself, but probably as the white middle class male, reflecting myself. Well, I've been fighting for gender mainstreaming since the 1980s, when I first became a planner and was talking about some basic issues relating to equality in the planning system. It's not new. but it's a fight we need to keep fighting, because we're not anywhere near in the right place yet. So it's a fair challenge. I think that what the COVID has done is brought these issues back onto the agenda in a major way. So I'm delighted that there's discussions going on. I said delighted is probably the wrong word, but I'm pleased to see that there's discussions going on, for example, about public open space. And I was engaged in a discussion quite recently about public open space and actually how different people perceive public open space. And it's not a white middle class Victorian park that everybody wants. And people's cultural perceptions of public open space differ. And I think that all I'd say is I welcome the fact that this is a debate which has now got greater traction, and the fact that people are talking about it more openly gives me some hope that we will be able to make more significant inroads into tackling these sorts of issues in the future.
Thanks, Steve. Jessica, do you want to come back in just on that question?
Yeah, I think I would agree with what Steve said. And I think there's a lot of scope as well. I know we talked about developing the local plans and sort of what we're pushing on a local basis, and sort of engaging with local sort of not just activist groups, but just local community groups, and to sort of facilitate some of these things being achieved, I think is really important. So I think there's a lot of scope within planning. I mean, obviously I'm not a planner myself, I'm an architect, but I feel like there's a lot of scope within planning to challenge some of these issues as well. Yeah,
that's an optimistic. So Donna, let's take another question.
Yeah, we've got quite a long one here. A very good point. Housing should be a basic human right. Instead, it's been turned into a commodity, a market. So what gets built is not what is needed, but what makes money. And in Leeds at the moment, it is student housing. Purpose-built student accommodation is profitable. So this is being built at a pace to the detriment of more mixed and balanced housing provision. Has buy-to-let run its course, as it had a devastating impact on social housing provision and has resulted in less home ownership, not more?
Okay, so Justin, has buy-to-let run its course? What's the market really doing in terms of delivering housing at the moment, and what impact is that happening?
Well, thank you, Quintin. First of all, I'd like to agree with David's point about affordable housing, and I was asked to speak about 18 months ago on this point, and I have to say that the introduction of right to buy and the new model for delivery of affordable housing that followed that has just been an abject failure, and we simply haven't provided the homes that people need at the affordable levels that are appropriate for them. So irrespective of getting to the point about the typologies of homes, we're just not delivering enough in terms of the numbers of homes in the right places for the people that need them at the affordable levels. And that has to change. And just that little glimmer of hope in Martin's slide from the 2020s about seeing the introduction of a bit of council housing coming back is encouraging, because I don't see the advent of another model that gets us to where we were with housing provision, and to have so much taken out of the public sector through right to buy and just simply not replaced has been an absolute shocker, frankly.
Well, thanks very much, Justin. Donna, another question?
Yep, we've got, with the number of properties proposed, are other amenities also being provided, such as schools, doctors and dentists, etc.?
Okay. David, could you give us a Leeds perspective on that? David? Sorry, I think we might have lost him. David, are you still there? Could you give us a Leeds perspective on that? No. Okay, pass that on to Steve. Are we getting the right facilities as well as the houses?
Well, it's difficult to answer that question specifically, isn't it? The ambition is yes, and that is exactly why the government sort of supported SIL and the community infrastructure levy, and it's kept Section 106 as a means of trying to ensure that a more holistic approach is taken to placemaking, and that schools, doctors, dentists are considered as part of that equation. The issue has been, and why people are talking about amendments to SIL, is of course the advent and SIL broke the link between specific sites and provision, and so quite often people would find that provision was not necessarily where the development was. Now the government has previously said that if things are being shown in development schemes and master planning, if schools are shown and the like, they want them to be open by the time people move in, and so it should be part of a place-making project, not moving in before the doctors and dentists or the schools are open. And of course, we all know, I think everybody listening to this, we all know that planning is complex, and actually some of the delivery mechanisms, the levers that you need to push and pull are not necessarily aligned. So the working with education providers and the like is not necessarily the gift of the planners, but ultimately the aim definitely is to ensure that all the provisions are provided together. Now, one of the things which is quite interesting, and just to pick up as to cross-reference the earlier discussion, is that, I mean, I've seen some places use some of the SIL revenue to try and address social inequality. So you may find you've got SIL income from a particular part of the city, but it's being channeled into other areas of the city to address the social deprivation in that particular part. And of course, that's within the scope of the local authority's SIL regime. But it does sort of throw a wider question about where these amenities are actually being provided. Broadly, I think the answer to the question is they should be, and that's the ambition of the placemaking agenda.
Thanks very much, Steele. Donna, let's take another question.
Yeah, we've got who should be responsible for promoting suitable and affordable housing post-COVID? Should this be the LPA, private planners, developers or local communities? What are the barriers to this?
Justin, do you want to start off with that one?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've got to work within the regime we've got to start with, and the regime we've got is one where the local authority sets its proportion based on its evidence base, and that can be spatially discrete, as in Leeds, where different parts of the city require different proportions of affordable housing, and it's down to the private house building market to deliver them. But as has been explained, very often the economics of bringing forward a particular site mean that level of affordable housing requirement is diluted or not delivered at all. And the way in which the coalface environment of negotiating a planning permission works is that the item of planning gain, to use that word that we all used to use, which is the affordable housing component, is the bit that tends to give, because it can. So if your ground conditions are such that you've got to spend so much money on getting your site right, or there are other issues that you have to fund, and your site can be demonstrated to be not viable at the level of affordable housing required because of the cost of that element, that tends to be the bit that goes. And that's precisely why it's the affordable housing delivery that suffered. So as to what you do about it, there would have to be a different model. But what certainly doesn't help is where you simply haven't got a local plan in place. And there's been numerous occasions that I've witnessed where provision of affordable housing has been entirely sidestepped by the absence of a up-to-date local plan having the required policy to support the claim for affordable housing. So that's got to be step one. that local authorities get those local plans in place to be able to insist on the very basic start point of the affordable housing provision.
Yes, that's first step there. Okay.
Thing, if I can. I mean, I want to come back and make a couple of links. I mean, the answer to the question is a plan-led system. So, getting absolutely right. Get something in the plan. Have your housing need identified. And the NPPF talks about housing tenure. It talks about housing mix. It talks about having a plan-led system which sets out what the needs are for the authority. Now, having reach that position, they need to link with the community. They need to be talking to the local community. It's a front notice system. It's supposed to be, it always has been since 2004. That's not new. And I think that having a plan that sets out what the affordable housing requirement is, I would expect to see in local plans. And it links to the viability question. There was a lot of mixed reviews when the government decided or tried to promote the idea that the viability issue should be addressed at the plan making stage. Now, on the face of it, at quite a high level, what the government was saying was, look, developers, site owners, landowners, don't put a site in, don't put a site forward if you can't develop it. Let's move away from what Martin was talking about earlier, where you say a site's viable to get it in the plan, but then when you make a planning application, you say it's not viable, so you can avoid your affordable housing requirements. If in the plan making stage you've done that assessment in the first place, you know what the policy requirement is. And the land value capture, which the government's talked about for a long while, is about trying to get at the landowner who makes the money from the value lift in the land from getting residential approval, and say, look, people, if you're going to put your site forward, if you know you want to see housing on it, you know what the policy requirement is. So do your calculation on that basis, and don't come back later and say you can't develop it because it's unviable. That's what a plan-led system is supposed to be trying to achieve. And that's why, despite the fact it got some mixed reviews about how can we possibly do this viability test at the early stage, the government was saying, well, you should do it because you shouldn't be putting in a site for development that you can't viably develop when you know the policy requirement is X% affordable housing. You should go into this with your eyes open. We've talked about certainty. We've talked about confidence for developers and investors. If they know what's required, then let's have it up front. And that's what the government's been trying to push for a while. And the issue is, of course, and it answers one of the earlier questions as well, is we work in a market. We work in a market where the different governments have got different views about home ownership and the way in which the market should operate. And we won't be able to avoid that. So we're always going to be working in that market. And so planning is complex. And this probably reflects that complexity.
Thanks, Steve. Donna, can we have another question?
Yeah, let's just see what else we've got.
I think there's one from Joshua.
Yes,
on
there is, yeah.
devolution.
How will devolution fit in with the post-COVID world, i.e. will the West Yorkshire Combined Authority and the powers of the new mayor help or hinder the delivery of planning objectives?
Okay, let's start that from a view from an existing combined authority. Jessica, you're in Manchester, aren't you? So a combined authority elected mayor. Is that going to be the answer to our problems? Is that going to deliver what we need?
It's a good question. I feel like it could do. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will. I mean, in Greater Manchester, sort of this last year, everyone's loves Andy Burnham. There's like sort of graffiti murals of his face around the Northern Quarter because when they were talking about the lockdown rules, and he, stood up and said no for Manchester. And I do think it's important to have sort of this representation at this level. To sort of recognise the sort of different needs of different communities, because thinking about sort of some of the issues we've talked about affordable housing, and you compare sort of the northern cities where I do a lot of work into work that we do in London, and sort of how the London plan is so prescriptive and sort of seen from an architect's perspective as sort of like the ideal thing to work from because it's so well defined. But obviously the reason is that they can afford to do their affordable housing because the land's so expensive and they get so much profit from it. it makes it a completely different situation to them working in Manchester, where I know that they deliver, I think it was 2018, they delivered like 0% affordable housing because of the viability issues. So Andy Burnham's come in with a lot of aspirations to sort of end homelessness and do a lot of work in that field. I feel like it's yet to be seen whether it's successful or not, but I think it's a good starting point.
Thanks, Jessica. Justin, what do you think? Local leadership, is that a factor, or is it all down to kind of, sort of central policies?
Well, yeah, I think it has the potential to help, because essentially you've got local leadership, you've got also the package of finance that comes with that. So you're getting more central government money to be pumping in to the locality. So you've got the ability to spend that with a local leadership, and that local leadership could theoretically reflect the needs of more intimately reflect the needs of that the local communities that they know about, and so it has the potential for that. In planning terms, theoretically, it's an opportunity for some significant cooperation between authority areas, but the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework is now fallen twice on this, and Stockport has taken its ball home, and is no longer part of the group. We only heard this week that they're now planning a third attempt at a joint development plan between the remaining 9 authorities. So here we go again, and will they all agree? So you've got the politics that come with that locally as well. So it has the potential, but it can be a time-consuming exercise. Is really my answer. I mean, I think I'm in favour of it on balance, because I think it brings it more investment, and it brings a local leadership to it, and you can apply local knowledge to solving local problems.
Thanks, Justin. David is back with us. David?
Yeah, sorry, I had to drop out before to take an urgent call, so sorry to have to drop out. In response to the question about the combined authority and the mayoral responsibility, I mean, I would support Steve and Justin's view that it has the potential to be helpful, to give some give us some traction at that broader strategic level. I think, just to note though, in West Yorkshire, the spatial development strategy was taken out of the devolution deal. We had a ministerial letter at the end of last year saying that the requirement to prepare a spatial development strategy had been removed within the context of the work in the emerging planning white paper. So in terms of a plan being prepared at that combined authority level, we will need to see what the planning white paper reforms bring and how that sits with the mayoral responsibilities when they're introduced. So taking Justin's point on board, we are significantly behind Greater Manchester in terms of even being able to prepare a spatial development strategy at this stage, because we need that statutory infrastructure putting in place to enable that plan making at the broader strategic level. That said, we have adopted local plans in place which have affordable housing targets within them already, and I would hope that we get continued support from government and elsewhere to be able to implement those policies effectively. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Steve, can we come back to you on this? I suppose a question about leadership in general, and perhaps thinking about Martin's point about the sort of lack of continuity in housing ministers. How important is it, do you think, to have a strong vision, a strong idea about where we want to go?
Well, I think Martin's comment about housing ministers, I have to say that when you're a chief planner, you have no control over how long ministers last and who comes in, who comes out. But it was interesting to work with so many. I think that the comment I was going to make was, The government since 2010 has been really quite keen on mayors, and I think one of the advantages of getting on in life is that you remember quotes from people in the past, and one of the quotes I remember is from Michael Heseltine, who talked about, I think his quote was something on the line, I'll probably get it wrong, show me the problem and then show me the person in charge. It was linked to his view about he was a great fan of mayors, that actually a lot of problems could be solved by there being somebody responsible for sorting it. And I think that sort of approach has driven the idea that having mayors in charge is a way of giving direct responsibility for people to sort things out. I generalize, but I think that there is a lot of support for mayors, and the idea that a single person in charge is able to do, as Jessica was saying earlier, Andy Burnham has said, Manchester is the place I'm responsible for. So I think that in general you can see more of it. A lot of the white paper stuff, I would say, don't forget that there's also a local government reorganisation agenda, and I think there is an argument that a lot of the white paper big thinking proposals are linked to the potential to reorganise local government. One of the things that has always been a challenge, that you've got a planning system which is delivered through local planning authorities, which is a great idea, but there's over 360 of them, and they're all doing the same thing at different times, at different places, and trying to do different objectives, which is, again, picking up on something Martin said, which is why I'm not so alarmed by, for example, moving development control policies into a sort of annex to the NPPF, if that's what they do. Because if you pick up at random 2 local plans, you will find in it, for example, a policy on heritage protection. Now the objective is the same, but the policies won't be. They'll one will be half a page, one will be a page and a half, and that's been examined. That's been written by somebody in a local planning authority. Some of that stuff could just be, we know what the policy should say. Let's have a model. Let's have a model policy that does that. So this idea of having a model approach is worth exploring. But the idea of my slide was to try and encourage people to think holistically. Nothing works in isolation. So there's always links and things knock on to other issues. So devolution, local government reorganisation, sort of simplification. These are all linked, and you need to see it in that context.
Thanks very much, Steve. So thinking holistically about planning for housing need. I think we've probably had our last question there. I don't think there's any more in the chat, is there, Donna?
Oh, we might just have had just one come in.
Okay,
let's
have a look at that.
Have we got time for one more?
Just take one more, please.
Yeah, okay. What can be done to address the poor interpretation of the tilted balance where economic factors outweigh environmental issues?
Okay, let's take Justin on this.
Thank you. It's a sort of bit of a growing controversy at the moment, this one, I think, and it seems to emanate from the direction of travel of a number of appeal decisions that are coming through, whereby and again, it's sort of the absence of a 5-year housing land supply. When it was first introduced through the NPPF, looked to be a tool that the house builders could use. So, used a tool that the house builders could use to secure more planning permissions. There was a great trend of the outturns that not all of them as poor as Martin was suggesting in terms of absence of local plan, 5-year housing land supply absence schemes, but increasingly it seems that the interpretation of that is that other factors are now starting to weigh in inspectors' minds, and the absence of the 5-year housing land supply is not the magic wand that it used to be to getting your planning permission, and increasingly weight to other issues is being given. And in Cheshire East, for example, what probably would have been seen as slam dunk approvals under a 5-year housing land supply absence have been dismissed, and these other factors are being brought in, given greater weight by inspectors. And there is a great deal of debate going on at the moment about whether that is right. I don't have an answer for it, because it's down to an individual inspector to weigh up any merits of a development in their own right, and that's what these schemes do. So but there's definitely been a tilt to the tilt, as it were, on the way in which the balance is being interpreted.
Yes, thanks very much indeed. Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time there, so I want to thank the presenters, and really, really interesting and demanding presentations. We've got plenty to think about now, and I also want to thank Donna for fielding the questions, for Duncan Hartley from Rural Solutions for giving me the inspiration for this event, and all of you for attending, for taking part, for your questions. We've had over 100 attendees, which is pretty good. Something to look forward to our next event and see if we can do the same. So if you found this interesting, our next Leeds Beckett University Planning School event is on the 20th of May, and we're going to be looking there about affordable housing supply and access to land. So following on some of the questions that we've had today, with speakers including Neil Graham from Homes England, Mark Denton, the head of Leeds City Council Housing Growth Team, Rosie Pearson from the Better Planning Campaign, and Daniel Starkey from Sporfus Planning Consultancy. So that's the 20th of May. The recording from this event will be on YouTube, and we'll be sending out links to everybody who attended and booked on. So and thanks very much for Donna and for Liz for topping and tailing that. That's brilliant. So happy Easter to everybody. I'm sure you're all looking forward to a bit of a break, and I think we all deserve it. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking part in this afternoon's event. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks to you too, Quintin.
Thank you, Donna.
Thanks. See ya.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks very much.